The dust swirled across the rocky canyon as Maria Strongheart emerged from her tent, her massive frame casting a shadow that stretched across half the Apache camp. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broader than most men's reach, she possessed a strength that had become legend throughout the Southwest Territories. Her coal-black hair hung in thick braids decorated with eagle feathers and silver ornaments that caught the morning light like flames. The Apache warriors gathered around the cooking fires fell silent as she approached. Even the bravest among them, men who had fought cavalry soldiers and Mexican bandits without flinching, lowered their eyes when Maria passed. She moved with surprising grace for someone of her size, each step deliberate and powerful, like a mountain cat stalking through tall grass. "Bring me my breakfast," she commanded in her deep, resonant voice that carried across the entire camp. 3 women immediately scrambled to prepare her meal, knowing better than to keep Maria waiting. She consumed twice what any man in the tribe ate, her appetite matching her enormous size. As she sat cross-legged on a specially woven blanket that could support her weight, Maria's dark eyes surveyed her domain. The Mescalero Apache band had grown prosperous under her unofficial leadership. While Chief Running Bear held the ceremonial title, everyone knew that Maria's word carried more weight than his. She had proven her dominance through countless displays of raw power. Young warriors would challenge her to tests of strength, hoping to gain respect by defeating the legendary woman. None had ever succeeded. Maria could lift boulders that required 4 men to move. She could bend iron horseshoes with her bare hands and snap rifle barrels like dry twigs. Her wrestling matches had become entertainment for the entire tribe, with betting pools on how quickly she would defeat her latest challenger. The morning sun climbed higher as a commotion arose near the camp's entrance. A scout came running, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. He leaped from his mount and rushed toward Chief Running Bear, but his eyes kept darting to Maria. She noticed his nervous glances and stood, her full height making nearby warriors step back. "Speak," she commanded, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. The scout swallowed hard before beginning his report. "A wagon train approaches from the east. 20 families, maybe more. They carry good supplies and have strong horses, but—" He hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "But what?" Maria's tone grew dangerous. "They have protection. Cowboys riding with them. Armed men who look like they know how to fight." Maria threw back her head and laughed, a sound like thunder rolling across the canyon walls. "Cowboys? These pale-faced cattle herders think they can protect anyone from us?" She flexed her massive arms, muscles rippling beneath her tanned skin. "I have broken stronger men than any cowboy. Their bullets bounce off my skin like raindrops." The last part was not entirely true, but Maria's reputation had grown so large that many believed she possessed supernatural powers. She encouraged these beliefs, knowing that fear could be as powerful as any weapon. Stories spread throughout the territory of the Apache woman who could catch arrows in flight and wrestle bears with her bare hands. Chief Running Bear approached carefully, his weathered face showing concern. "Maria, perhaps we should be cautious. These white men carry many guns and their bullets are swift." She turned on him with blazing eyes. "Are you questioning my strength, old man? Have you forgotten who brought victory in our last 3 raids? Who carried back the stolen horses when our warriors fell wounded?" The chief lowered his head. "I meant no disrespect. Your power is beyond question." Maria's anger seemed to satisfy her, and she returned her attention to the approaching wagon train. In her mind, she was already planning the attack. The wagons would provide valuable supplies for winter, and defeating their cowboy protectors would only add to her legend. "Send watchers to the ridge," she ordered. "I want to know everything about these travelers. How many guns they carry, how they make camp, which among them looks strongest." She paused, a cruel smile playing across her lips. "Especially their strongest man. I want to face him myself." As the warriors dispersed to carry out her commands, Maria began her daily training routine. She lifted massive stones above her head, each one weighing more than a full-grown horse. Sweat glistened on her bronze skin as she worked, her breathing steady despite the enormous weights she handled. Young Apache women watched from a distance, both awed and frightened by her display. Maria had never married, claiming that no man in any tribe was worthy of her strength. She had challenged warriors from other bands when they came to trade, always emerging victorious. Her reputation had spread beyond the Apache Nation to other tribes throughout the region. By midday, the scouts returned with detailed information about the wagon train. 23 families traveled together, carrying everything they owned toward California. 15 cowboys rode with them, led by a man the scouts described as tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and steady hands. "His name is Jake Morrison," reported the lead scout. "The other cowboys treat him with respect. He carries himself like a leader and his horse is the finest among them." Maria listened intently, her interest growing. "How does he move? Does he show fear when scanning for threats?" "No fear," the scout replied. "He studies the land like a hunter, always alert but never nervous." The other men looked to him for decisions. This information pleased Maria greatly. Defeating a respected leader would provide maximum glory for her legend. She imagined the stories that would spread across the territories after she crushed this Jake Morrison in single combat. As evening approached, Maria called the war council together. Warriors, elders, and respected women gathered around the central fire as she outlined her plan for attacking the wagon train. They would strike at dawn when the travelers were breaking camp, hitting hard and fast to overwhelm their defenses. "I claim the right to face their leader in personal combat," she announced. "Let the cowboys see their strongest man broken by Apache strength. Let them know that no white man can match the power of Maria Strongheart." The council agreed unanimously, knowing better than to argue with their most formidable warrior. As the meeting ended and the camp settled into evening routines, Maria stood alone beneath the stars, flexing her enormous hands and planning her victory. Tomorrow would bring another chapter to her legend, another demonstration of the crushing power that had made her name feared throughout the Southwest. No cowboy, no matter how skilled with guns or horses, could possibly match the raw strength that flowed. Through her massive frame, the night wind carried the scent of sage and distant campfires as Maria prepared for what she was certain would be her greatest triumph. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his horse along the rocky trail, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the surrounding cliffs and canyon walls. 20 years of working cattle drives and protecting settlers had taught him to read the land like a book. And right now, every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. The wagon train stretched out behind him in a long, dusty line. 23 families had pooled their resources to hire Jake and his crew of 14 experienced cowboys for protection during their journey to California. Most were farmers and shopkeepers seeking new opportunities in the West, carrying their life savings and precious belongings in wooden wagons pulled by oxen and horses. "Boss, you see something up there?" asked Tommy Rodriguez, his youngest cowboy, as he rode up alongside Jake's mount. Jake's steel-gray eyes continued studying the ridgeline above them. "Can't shake the feeling we're being watched. Been getting that itch between my shoulder blades for the past hour." Tommy was barely 20, quick with his gun but still learning to read the subtle signs that veteran trail hands recognized instinctively. "Think it might be Apache?" "We're definitely in their territory now." "Most likely," Jake replied, his voice calm despite the tension building in his chest. "Pass word back to the others. Tell them to keep their rifles handy but don't make it obvious. No point spooking the families unless we're sure." As Tommy rode back down the line, Jake reflected on the warnings they'd received at the last trading post. Stories had reached them about an Apache band led by a woman of incredible size and strength. The trader, a grizzled man named Pete Hawkins, had sworn the tales were true. "Seen her myself," Pete had insisted, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey. 7 feet tall if she's an inch, built like a grizzly bear. They say she can lift a full-grown steer over her head and snap a man's spine like kindling. The Apache warriors follow her like she's some kind of goddess. Jake had listened politely but remained skeptical. In his experience, frontier stories grew larger with each telling. A tall, strong woman might become a giant in the retelling, especially when men's pride was involved in being defeated by a female opponent. Still, he'd made sure his crew was prepared for any threat they might encounter. Each man carried a rifle, 2 pistols, and plenty of ammunition. They'd positioned the strongest fighters at the front and rear of the wagon train, with experienced men riding the flanks. Jake had learned long ago that preparation was the key to survival in hostile territory. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as they descended into a narrow canyon that would provide shelter for their evening camp. Jake chose a spot where the wagons could form a defensive circle with their backs to a cliff wall, limiting the directions from which an attack could come. As the families began making camp, Jake gathered his men for a quiet conference. "I don't like this place," he told them, keeping his voice low. "Too many blind spots, too many places for hostiles to hide. We'll set a double watch tonight and keep the horses inside the circle." Red Williams, his oldest and most trusted hand, nodded grimly. "Been feeling eyes on us all day. Whatever's out there, they're taking their time studying us. Could be they're waiting for us to let our guard down," suggested Bill Carson, a stocky Texan with 20 years of Indian fighting experience. "Apache are patient hunters. They'll watch for days before making their move." Jake assigned the watch schedules and made sure every man understood his position in case of attack. The families were told to keep their weapons close and be ready to take cover behind the wagons at the first sign of trouble. As darkness fell, Jake found himself unable to relax despite his exhaustion. He walked the perimeter of their camp, checking the sentries and studying the shadows beyond their firelight. Something was definitely out there waiting and watching. Around midnight, a sound from the darkness made every horse in the camp stamp and snort nervously. Jake grabbed his rifle and moved toward the sound, his boots silent on the rocky ground. Behind him, he heard his men taking their positions without need for orders. "Easy, boss," whispered Red Williams from behind a wagon wheel. Could be just a wild animal passing through. But Jake's instincts told him otherwise. The sound had been too deliberate, too calculated. Someone was testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses in their setup. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Jake got no sleep. He stood watch with his men, drinking strong coffee and studying every shadow that moved beyond their firelight. When dawn finally broke, painting the canyon walls with golden light, he felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "Pack it up," he called to the families. "We move out in 30 minutes." As the wagons began rolling again, Jake noticed fresh horse tracks in the soft dirt near their camp. Unshod ponies, definitely Indian mounts. He counted at least 20 different sets of hoof prints, confirming his suspicions about being watched. "They know exactly where we are," he told Red as they rode point together. "Question is, when do they plan to make their move?" "My guess is they'll hit us in that open stretch about 5 miles ahead," Red replied. "Good ground for a mounted charge, hard for us to find cover." Jake had been thinking the same thing. The trail ahead opened into a wide valley with sparse vegetation and few places to ford up if attacked. It would be perfect territory for Apache warriors on horseback to use their superior mobility against a slow-moving wagon train. "Send word back," Jake decided. "Tell everyone to check their weapons one more time. If they're going to hit us, it'll be soon." As the morning progressed, the feeling of being watched intensified. Jake could almost feel hostile eyes studying every move they made, counting their weapons and measuring their defenses. The horses seemed to sense it too, stepping nervously and whinnying at shadows. When they reached the open valley, Jake deployed his men in a protective formation around the wagons. He placed his best shooters on the flanks where they could provide covering fire, while keeping the fastest riders near the families in case they needed to mount a rescue. The attack, when it came, erupted from 3 directions at once. Apache warriors seemed to materialize from the earth itself, their war cries echoing off the valley walls as they charged toward the wagon train. But what caught Jake's attention immediately was the massive figure leading the assault. Even at a distance, he could see this was no ordinary Apache warrior. The rider was enormous, easily dwarfing the other attackers, and rode with a confidence that spoke of absolute authority. As the figure drew closer, Jake realized with shock that Pete Hawkins' stories might not have been exaggerated after all. The Apache woman leading the charge was indeed a giant among humans, her size and presence dominating the battlefield. She rode without saddle or bridle, controlling her horse through pure strength and will, a massive war club swinging in her right hand. "Holy Mother of God," whispered Red Williams, his voice filled with awe and terror. "That can't be real." But it was very real, and it was heading straight for their defensive position with the fury of a natural disaster given human form. The earth trembled beneath the thundering hooves as Maria Strongheart led her warriors across the valley floor. Her massive warhorse, a stallion specially bred and trained to carry her enormous weight, moved like liquid lightning despite its burden. Behind her rode 30 of the finest Apache warriors, their painted faces twisted in battle fury as they closed the distance to the wagon train. Maria felt the familiar surge of power that always accompanied combat. Her blood sang with anticipation as she imagined the terror on the cowboys' faces when they saw her approaching. She had painted her face with red and black war paint, and her massive frame was decorated with symbols of her countless victories. Eagle feathers streaming from her hair caught the morning wind as she raised her war club high above her head. The weapon itself was a thing of legend among the Apache people. Carved from ironwood and studded with sharp stones, it weighed nearly 30 pounds. Most men could barely lift it with both hands, but Maria wielded it one-handed like it was made of air. She had crushed dozens of enemies with that club, and today she planned to add cowboy skulls to her collection. As the distance closed, Maria's keen eyes picked out the defensive formation the settlers had arranged. The wagons formed a rough circle with armed men positioned at strategic points. She counted 15 defenders, all carrying rifles and looking determined despite the overwhelming odds against them. But it was the tall figure standing near the lead wagon that captured her attention. Even from several hundred yards away, she could see this man was different from the others. He stood without fear, his rifle held ready but not frantically waving like some of his companions. His posture spoke of confidence and experience. "That one," she called to her war chief, Running Wolf, who rode beside her. "The tall one with the steady hands. He is their leader. I claim him for myself." Running Wolf nodded, knowing better than to argue with Maria's wishes. The other warriors would handle the remaining defenders while she dealt with their strongest fighter. It had become her signature tactic, breaking enemy morale by destroying their leader in single combat. The first volley of rifle fire erupted from the wagon train as the Apache came within range. Maria heard bullets whining past her head but felt no fear. She had been shot before and survived through sheer toughness and determination. Pain was just another enemy to be conquered through superior will. One of her warriors cried out and tumbled from his horse as a bullet found its mark, but the rest of the war party never slowed. They split into 3 groups as planned, attacking from different angles to divide the defenders' fire and create confusion. Maria drove straight toward the center of the defensive line, her war cry rising above the chaos of battle. The sound that emerged from her throat was not quite human, a primal roar that spoke of ancient fury and unstoppable power. Several of the settlers' horses reared in terror at the sound, nearly throwing their riders. The tall cowboy she had marked as her target stepped forward to meet her charge, his rifle coming up smoothly to his shoulder. Maria saw the muzzle flash and felt the bullet tear through the meat of her left shoulder, but she did not slow down or show any sign of pain. Instead, she laughed, a sound that carried clearly over the din of battle. "You cannot stop me, Pale Eyes," she roared in English, her accent thick but understandable. "I am Maria Strongheart, and your bullets are like bee stings to me." Jake Morrison worked the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency, chambering another round as the enormous Apache woman bore down on him. He had seen her take his shot without flinching, blood streaming from her wounded shoulder, but no change in her expression of savage determination. His second shot caught her in the thigh, but again she showed no reaction except to urge her horse to greater speed. Jake had hunted grizzly bears that reacted more strongly to bullet wounds than this terrifying woman warrior. 20 yards away, Maria suddenly leaped from her galloping horse in a move that defied belief. Her massive body sailed through the air with surprising grace, the war club raised high above her head as she aimed to crash down on her target like a human avalanche. Jake threw himself sideways, rolling behind a water barrel as Maria's club smashed into the ground where he had been standing. The iron-hard wood split the earth and sent fragments of stone flying in all directions. The force of the blow would have crushed his skull like an eggshell. Before he could bring his rifle to bear again, Maria spun with cat-like quickness and backhanded him across the chest. Despite her wounded shoulder, the blow had enough force to lift Jake off his feet and send him flying backward into the side of a wagon. The wooden planks cracked under the impact, and Jake felt his ribs protesting as he hit the ground. "Is this the best your people can offer?" Maria taunted, advancing on him with her club ready to deliver the killing blow. "I have wrestled with mountain lions that fought harder than you." Jake rolled away as the club smashed into the earth again, missing his head by inches. He came up in a crouch, drawing his pistol since his rifle had been knocked from his hands. At point-blank range, he put 3 bullets into Maria's chest, the heavy .45 caliber rounds that should have dropped a charging buffalo. Maria staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stains on her buckskin shirt, with what appeared to be mild surprise. Then she looked back at Jake and smiled, her white teeth gleaming against her painted face. "Now you begin to anger me, cowboy," she said, raising her war club again. "Perhaps you will provide some sport after all." Around them, the battle raged as Apache warriors clashed with the remaining defenders. Jake could hear the crack of rifle fire and the screams of wounded men, but his entire world had narrowed to the massive woman stalking toward him with murder in her dark eyes. He fired his remaining 3 shots into her torso, each bullet striking home but seeming to have no more effect than the first volley. Maria's massive frame seemed to absorb punishment that would have killed any normal human being. "Impossible," Jake muttered, reaching for his second pistol with hands that trembled slightly despite his iron self-control. "Nothing is impossible for Maria Strongheart," she replied, lunging forward with her club raised high. "I am stronger than any man, tougher than leather, and meaner than a wounded grizzly. Today you die, and tonight the coyotes will feast on your bones." But Jake Morrison had not survived 20 years on the frontier by giving up when faced with impossible odds. As Maria's club descended toward his skull, he threw himself forward instead of backward, sliding between her massive legs and coming up behind her. His knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, a 10-inch blade of Damascus steel that had saved his life more times than he could count. Without hesitation, he drove it toward Maria's back, aiming for the kidney. The blade struck and penetrated, but only barely. It was like trying to stab a tree trunk, and Jake realized with growing horror that this woman's muscles were so developed they provided natural armor against edged weapons. Maria spun around with a roar of fury, her backhand catching Jake across the face and sending him sprawling in the dust. Stars exploded behind his eyes, and he tasted blood from his split lip. "Now you have truly made me angry, little man," Maria growled, advancing on him again. "Death will be too merciful for you." Jake Morrison spat blood into the dust as he struggled to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The taste of copper filled his mouth, and his vision swam from the devastating backhand Maria had delivered. Around him, the battle continued to rage, but the sounds seemed distant and muffled, as if he were underwater. Maria stalked toward him like a great predator, her war club dragging behind her and leaving a furrow in the hard-packed earth. Blood streamed from multiple bullet wounds, but she moved with the same confident power as when the fight began. Her dark eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and anticipation. "You fight better than most white men," she admitted, her voice carrying a grudging respect. "But fighting well and winning are different things. Today you learn the difference." Jake wiped blood from his eyes and tried to think clearly despite the ringing in his head. Every conventional weapon he possessed had failed against this impossible woman. Bullets that should have dropped her had barely slowed her down. His knife had been like a needle against an elephant's hide, but 20 years of survival had taught him that there was always another way, always some weakness to exploit, if a man was clever enough to find it. He just needed time to think, time to observe, time to understand what he was truly fighting. "You're strong," Jake said, buying precious seconds while his vision cleared. "Stronger than any person I've ever seen. But strength isn't everything in a fight." Maria paused, intrigued by his words. "What else matters, Pale Eyes?" "Speed, I am fast as well. Skill? I have fought more battles than you have seen sunrises. What do you possess that can match the power of Maria Strongheart?" Jake studied her carefully, looking for any sign of weakness. The bullet wounds were bleeding freely, but they seemed to have no effect on her fighting ability. Her massive muscles rippled beneath her painted skin like steel cables. Even her breathing remained steady despite the exertion of combat. Then he noticed something subtle, something that might not have been apparent to a less experienced fighter. Despite her boasts and confident posture, Maria was favoring her left leg slightly. The bullet wound in her thigh was deeper than she was admitting, and her body's natural attempt to protect the injury was creating a small but exploitable weakness. "Experience teaches patience," Jake replied, beginning to circle slowly to his right. "And patience reveals opportunities." Maria matched his movement, keeping the club ready to strike. "Pretty words will not save you, cowboy. I grow tired of this game." She lunged forward with surprising speed, the war club whistling through the air in a horizontal arc that would have shattered Jake's ribs if it connected. But Jake had been watching her feet, and he saw the slight hesitation as she transferred weight to her wounded leg. He ducked under the swing and rolled to his left, coming up with a handful of sand and gravel that he flung into Maria's eyes. She roared in fury and swung blindly, but Jake was already moving, staying low and using her own massive size against her. While Maria rubbed at her eyes, Jake spotted his rifle lying near an overturned water barrel. He dove for it, rolling as another wild swing from the war club smashed into the ground where he had been. His hands closed around the familiar wooden stock, and he worked the lever to chamber a fresh round. But instead of aiming for Maria's torso, where her incredible toughness had already proven bullets ineffective, Jake aimed for her wounded thigh. At close range, the heavy rifle bullet struck with devastating effect, tearing through muscle and bone that had already been weakened by his earlier shot. Maria's roar of pain was the first truly human sound she had made since the fight began. She staggered, her left leg buckling slightly under her enormous weight. For the first time, Jake saw uncertainty flicker in her dark eyes. "Now you feel it," Jake said grimly, working the rifle lever again. Pain has a way of cutting through pride. But Maria's response was not retreat or surrender. Instead, her fury seemed to double, and she charged forward with reckless abandon, ignoring the weakness in her leg. Her war club swung in a devastating overhead strike that Jake barely avoided by throwing himself sideways. The club struck the ground with such force that it became embedded in the hard earth. For a crucial moment, Maria struggled to free her weapon, and Jake seized the opportunity. He reversed his rifle and drove the wooden stock into her wounded shoulder with all his strength. Maria's grip on the club loosened, and Jake followed up by grabbing the weapon's handle and twisting it from her grasp. For the first time in their fight, the Apache warrior found herself disarmed. But even without her club, Maria remained a formidable opponent. She grabbed Jake by the shirt front with both hands and lifted him clear off the ground, her massive strength making his weight seem insignificant. Her intent was clearly to dash his brains out against the nearest wagon wheel. Jake responded by driving his knee upward into Maria's wounded shoulder, targeting the exact spot where his rifle bullet had torn through muscle and sinew. The pain caused her grip to weaken just enough for him to break free, and he landed hard on his feet beside her. Both fighters were breathing heavily now, circling each other like wounded animals. Maria's multiple injuries were finally beginning to tell, though her pride would never allow her to show weakness. Jake's face was swollen and bloodied, and he suspected at least 2 of his ribs were cracked. "You are more than I expected," Maria admitted between gasps. "But this changes nothing. I am still Maria Strongheart, and you are still just a man." Jake noticed that her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The pain from her wounds was breaking through her iron will, and her movements had lost some of their fluid grace. She was still incredibly dangerous, but for the first time, victory seemed possible. "Maybe," Jake replied, raising his fists in a boxing stance he had learned in saloons from Texas to Montana. "But sometimes being just a man is enough." Around them, the battle between the Apache warriors and the remaining defenders continued, but both combatants had forgotten about everything except their personal duel. This had become something more than a fight for survival. It was a test of wills, a clash between 2 different philosophies of strength and determination. Maria rushed forward again, her massive fists swinging in powerful haymakers that would have killed Jake instantly if they connected. But injured as she was, her movements were no longer quite fast enough to catch the experienced fighter. Jake ducked and weaved, using his smaller size and superior mobility to stay just out of reach of those devastating punches. Each time Maria swung and missed, he countered with quick jabs to her wounded areas, gradually wearing down her legendary endurance through accumulated damage. The tide of their personal battle was slowly turning, though neither fighter was yet ready to admit it. The afternoon sun climbed higher as the brutal fight continued, both combatants pushing their bodies beyond normal human endurance. Jake's face was a mask of blood and sweat, his shirt torn to ribbons from Maria's grasping fingers. Every breath sent sharp pains through his damaged ribs, but he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping meant death. Maria's legendary strength was finally beginning to wane under the accumulated damage from multiple wounds. Her left leg could barely support her massive weight, and dark blood stained her buckskin clothing from shoulder to knee. Yet her eyes still burned with unquenchable fury, and her voice carried the same commanding authority that had made her feared throughout the Apache territories. "You think you are winning, Pale Eyes?" she gasped, wiping blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. "This is nothing. I have fought wounded bears and mountain lions. I have battled enemy warriors while arrows pierced my flesh. You are just another test that I will overcome." Jake circled carefully, looking for another opening while keeping his distance from those massive fists. He had learned respect for Maria's incredible toughness, but he had also discovered that she was not invincible. Pain was her enemy just as much as his, and he was slowly winning that war of attrition. "I believe you," Jake replied honestly, "but those bears and mountain lions aren't here to help you now. It's just you and me, and I'm still standing." Maria's response was another charging attack, but this time Jake was ready for it. As she lumbered forward on her injured leg, he sidestepped at the last moment and grabbed her wounded arm, using her own momentum to send her crashing into the side of a wagon. The wooden plank splintered under the impact, and Maria went down hard in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, Jake thought the fight might be over. Maria lay motionless among the broken boards, her massive chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to breathe. Blood trickled from a new cut on her forehead where she had struck the wagon's iron reinforcement. But even as Jake watched, the Apache warrior began to stir. With superhuman determination, she pushed herself up to her hands and knees, then slowly rose to her feet. Her movements were unsteady now, and she had to lean against the damaged wagon for support, but her spirit remained unbroken. "Impossible," Jake muttered, though by now he was beginning to understand that this word had little meaning when applied to Maria Strongheart. Nothing is impossible. "For me," Maria panted, each word requiring tremendous effort. "I am the strongest woman who ever lived. No man can defeat me. No man ever will." Despite her wounds and obvious exhaustion, she pushed away from the wagon and raised her fists again. Her stance was shaky and her left leg trembled with the effort of supporting her weight, but her determination remained as solid as granite. Jake felt a strange mixture of admiration and pity for his opponent. He had never encountered anyone, man or woman, with such incredible willpower. Most fighters would have collapsed long ago from the injuries Maria had sustained, yet she continued to stand and fight. Around them, the sounds of battle were beginning to fade. Jake could hear his men calling out status reports and the voices of settlers checking on their wounded. The Apache attack was failing, their warriors retreating in the face of determined resistance from the wagon train's defenders. "Your warriors are pulling back," Jake observed, hoping to convince Maria to surrender. "The battle is over. You've lost." Maria's laugh was bitter and filled with pain. "I never lose. I may die, but I do not lose. If my warriors retreat, they are cowards who do not deserve to follow Maria Strongheart. I fight alone if necessary." She stumbled forward, swinging a wild right hand that Jake barely avoided. Her balance was completely gone now, and she nearly fell after the missed punch. But somehow she managed to stay upright, her massive will holding her broken body together through sheer force of personality. Jake realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This woman's refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that she was beaten, was both inspiring and terrifying. But the fight had to end. Maria was dying on her feet, her blood loss severe enough that continued combat would likely kill her. Despite everything she had put him through, Jake found himself reluctant to deliver the final blow that would end her life. "You fought with more courage than any warrior I've ever faced," Jake said respectfully. "Male or female, Apache or white, it doesn't matter. You're the toughest opponent I've ever encountered, but it's over now. You need medical attention or you're going to bleed to death." Maria's response was to spit blood at his feet. "I would rather die standing than live kneeling. If you want to finish this, cowboy, then finish it. But know that Maria Strongheart died as she lived, fighting to the very end." Jake looked into her eyes and saw something that made him pause. Despite her words about preferring death, there was still a flicker of hope buried deep in those dark depths. She wanted to live, wanted to continue her legendary existence, but her pride would not allow her to surrender. "There's another way," Jake said quietly. "Single combat, winner take all. If you win, I'll lay down my arms and let you walk away. If I win, you surrender yourself and your remaining warriors." Maria considered this proposal, her head tilted slightly despite the obvious pain it caused her. "What makes you think I have not already given everything I possess in this fight? You speak of single combat as if we have not been fighting with our lives for the past hour." "I mean something different," Jake explained, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Not a fight to the death, but a test of pure strength. You've claimed to be stronger than any man alive. Prove it without weapons, without trying to kill each other. Just raw power against raw power." The offer intrigued Maria despite her condition. Throughout her life, she had used her incredible strength to dominate opponents through fear and overwhelming force. The idea of a pure test of power, stripped of weapons and deadly intent, appealed to something deep in her warrior's soul. "You would risk everything on such a contest?" she asked, swaying slightly as another wave of pain washed through her massive frame. Even wounded as I am, my strength could crush you like a twig. Jake nodded solemnly. That's the gamble I'm willing to take. But if I win, you accept defeat honorably and order your warriors to withdraw permanently from this territory. No more raids, no more attacks on wagon trains. Maria's eyes blazed with renewed interest. The cowboy was offering her something no opponent ever had. A chance to prove her legendary strength in pure competition, rather than deadly combat. Even in her weakened state, she believed her power was still superior to any man's, and if I win, she demanded, then you've proven your claim. I'll spread word throughout the territories that Maria Strongheart truly is stronger than any man alive. Your legend will grow beyond anything it is now. The proposition was tempting almost beyond resistance. Maria had built her entire identity around being the strongest human being alive. To have that strength acknowledged by a worthy opponent, even an enemy, would be worth more than any victory in battle. Very well, cowboy, she said, straightening to her full height despite the agony it caused. But understand this. When I prove my superiority, you will keep your word about spreading my legend. The name of Maria Strongheart will be spoken with fear and respect from here to the Pacific Ocean. Jake extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Maria grasped it with her own massive fingers. Her grip was still incredibly powerful, even weakened by blood loss and exhaustion. Jake felt the bones in his hand compress under the pressure, but he managed not to wince. Agreed, he said simply. The few remaining Apache warriors had gathered at a safe distance, watching their legendary leader with mixture of awe and concern. The settlers too had emerged from their defensive positions, drawn by curiosity about this strange turn of events. Jake looked around at the battlefield where moments before men had been trying to kill each other with rifle and arrow. Now it would become an arena for a different kind of contest, one that would determine not just the outcome of this particular conflict, but potentially the future of Maria Strongheart's legendary status. What did you have in mind for this test? Maria asked, her voice carrying its familiar note of confidence despite her obvious pain. Jake studied the area around them, looking for something that would provide a fair measure of their respective strengths. His eyes settled on a massive boulder that had fallen from the canyon rim sometime in the distant past. It was roughly spherical, about 4 feet in diameter, and looked like it would weigh at least a ton. That rock, he said, pointing to the boulder. Whoever can move it the farthest wins. Maria followed his gaze and smiled grimly. The boulder was indeed enormous, far beyond what any normal person could hope to budge. But she had lifted heavier objects in demonstrations of her power, and even in her current condition she believed she could manage it. Acceptable, she said, but I choose to go first. When you see what I can accomplish, you may wish to withdraw your challenge. Jake stepped back to give her room, noting that several of his men were positioning themselves with rifles ready. They clearly didn't trust this temporary truce, and Jake couldn't blame them. But he had given his word, and he intended to honor it regardless of the outcome. Maria approached the boulder slowly, her wounded leg forcing her to limp heavily. But as she studied the massive stone, calculating angles and grip points, her movements became more confident. This was familiar territory for her, the kind of feat that had built her reputation throughout the Apache territories. She circled the boulder once, examining it from all angles before settling on her approach. Then, with careful deliberation, she squatted down and worked her massive hands underneath the stone's base. Her face contorted with effort as she began to lift, her injured muscles screaming in protest but responding to her iron will. The silence that fell over the canyon was absolute as Maria Strongheart positioned herself beneath the massive boulder. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the legendary Apache warrior prepared to demonstrate the strength that had made her name feared. Throughout the Southwest Territories, blood continued to seep from her multiple wounds, darkening the earth beneath her feet, but Maria's focus was complete. She had lifted boulders before, but never while so severely injured. This would be the ultimate test of whether her will could overcome the limitations of her damaged flesh. Her massive hands found purchase on the rough stone surface, fingers that could bend iron horseshoes now seeking the perfect grip on unyielding granite. The boulder had probably sat in this spot for centuries, worn smooth by wind and rain, but Maria was determined to make it move. "By the spirits of my ancestors," she whispered in Apache, calling upon the spiritual power that had always supplemented her physical strength, "grant me the force to prove my worth one final time." The watching crowd held its collective breath as Maria began to lift. Her face contorted with tremendous effort, every muscle in her massive frame standing out like steel cables under tension. The veins in her neck and forehead bulged as she strained against the boulder's immense weight. For long moments, nothing happened. The stone remained firmly planted in the earth where it had rested since time immemorial. Jake began to wonder if even Maria's legendary strength was insufficient for such a task, especially in her wounded condition. Then, with a grinding sound like the earth itself protesting, the boulder began to move, first just a fraction of an inch, then more, as Maria's incredible power slowly overcame the force of gravity and inertia. Gasps arose from the watching settlers and Apache warriors alike as they witnessed something that defied rational belief. Maria's roar of effort echoed off the canyon walls as she straightened her legs, lifting the massive stone clear of the ground. For a moment she stood there, trembling with exertion, holding more than a ton of granite above her knees. Blood from her wounds dripped steadily onto the earth below, but her grip remained firm. With a tremendous heave, she took 3 shuffling steps forward before her strength finally gave out. The boulder crashed back to earth with a sound like thunder, leaving a crater in the hard-packed dirt. Maria staggered backward, her chest heaving as she fought for breath, but her eyes blazed with triumph. "There," she gasped, wiping sweat and blood from her face. "Let any man match that if he can. I have moved a mountain stone despite wounds that would have killed lesser warriors. Your turn, cowboy." Jake stared at the boulder in its new resting place, marked by the deep impressions Maria's feet had left in the earth. 3 steps might not sound like much, but moving that immense weight even a few inches was a feat of strength beyond anything he had imagined possible. The watching crowd buzzed with amazement and speculation. Several of Jake's men looked at him with expressions that clearly said he was insane to attempt matching such a display. Even Red Williams, who had known Jake for 15 years, shook his head in disbelief. "Boss, maybe you should reconsider," Red called out quietly. "That woman just did something that ain't humanly possible. No shame in admitting when you're outmatched." But Jake had given his word, and more importantly, he had observed something during Maria's lift that the others had missed. Despite her incredible feat, the effort had cost her dearly. Fresh blood stained her clothing and her legs shook with exhaustion. She was running on pure determination now, her body pushed far beyond its natural limits. "A deal is a deal," Jake replied, walking toward the boulder. "Besides, strength isn't just about raw power. Sometimes it's about finding the right approach." As he studied the massive stone, Jake's mind raced through everything he had learned about leverage and physics during his years of moving cattle, building corrals and handling heavy equipment. The boulder was indeed enormous, but it was also roughly spherical, which meant it could potentially be rolled rather than lifted. Maria had demonstrated her approach, pure muscular power applied directly against the stone's weight. It was an impressive display, but Jake suspected there might be a more efficient method. He circled the boulder several times, examining the ground around it and noting the slight depression where it had originally rested. The earth here was hard-packed but not completely level. A small slope led away from the boulder's position toward a cluster of smaller rocks about 20 yards distant. "You waste time with your thinking." "Pale eyes," Maria taunted, though her voice carried less venom than before. "Strength is strength. Either you possess it or you do not." Jake knelt beside the boulder and began clearing away loose rocks and debris from around its base. Several spectators exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what the cowboy was planning. Even Maria watched with curiosity as Jake methodically prepared the ground. "In my experience," Jake said conversationally as he worked, "the smartest approach usually beats the strongest one. Nothing against your power. What you just did was incredible, but there's often more than one way to solve a problem." He positioned himself at the back of the boulder, placing his shoulder against the stone's surface rather than trying to get his hands underneath it. Instead of attempting to lift the massive weight, Jake began to push, applying steady pressure while using his legs to drive forward. For several seconds, nothing happened. The boulder remained motionless despite Jake's efforts, and Maria's expression showed growing satisfaction. Then, almost imperceptibly, the great stone began to rock slightly in its crater. Jake adjusted his position and pushed harder, feeling the boulder start to respond to his efforts. Unlike Maria's dramatic lift, his approach was gradual and methodical. Each push caused the stone to rock a little more, building momentum slowly but steadily. "What are you doing?" Maria demanded, her voice showing the first hint of uncertainty she had displayed since the contest began. "Basic physics," Jake grunted, continuing his steady pressure. Sometimes you don't need to fight gravity. You just need to work with it. Suddenly, the boulder tipped past its balance point and began to roll. Once in motion, its enormous weight became an advantage rather than an obstacle. Jake stayed behind it, pushing continuously to maintain its momentum as it rolled down the slight slope. The watching crowd stared in amazement as the massive stone picked up speed, rolling past the point where Maria had dropped it and continuing onward. Jake ran behind it, still pushing when he could reach it, guiding its path around obstacles and keeping it moving toward the distant cluster of rocks. When the boulder finally came to rest against a pile of smaller stones, it had traveled nearly 30 yards from its starting point, 10 times farther than Maria had managed to carry it. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stood breathing heavily beside the relocated boulder, his shirt soaked with sweat but his expression calm. He had moved the same massive stone much farther than the legendary Maria Strongheart, and he had done it without the dramatic display of raw power that had marked her attempt. Maria stared at the distant boulder with an expression of complete shock. For the first time in her adult life, a man had bested her in a contest of strength. The fact that he had used cleverness rather than pure muscle somehow made the defeat even more devastating to her pride. The canyon fell into profound silence as the implications of what had just occurred settled over everyone present. Maria Strongheart, the legendary Apache warrior who had never known defeat, stood motionless beside the crater where the boulder had originally rested. Her massive frame trembled, not from her wounds but from the emotional earthquake that was reshaping her entire understanding of herself. For 30 years, Maria had built her identity around being stronger than any man alive. Her incredible physical power had been the foundation of her authority, her self-worth, and her place in the world. Now, in front of dozens of witnesses from both sides of the conflict, that foundation had crumbled like sand. Jake Morrison walked slowly back from where the boulder had come to rest, his own breathing labored but his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. He had won their contest, but he took no joy in seeing the devastating effect his victory was having on his opponent. The contest was about moving the stone the farthest distance, Jake said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. By that measure, I won. Do you accept the result? Maria's dark eyes remained fixed on the distant boulder, as if she could will it back to its original position through sheer force of desire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I do not understand. I lifted that stone with my own hands, carried it through pure strength. You merely pushed it. How can pushing be considered superior to lifting? Because the contest wasn't about who was stronger, Jake replied gently. It was about who could move the boulder farthest. You chose to demonstrate your incredible strength, and what you accomplished was amazing. But I chose to focus on the goal itself. Running Wolf, Maria's war chief, approached cautiously from where the Apache warriors had been watching. His weathered face showed confusion and concern as he looked between his defeated leader and the cowboy who had somehow accomplished the impossible. Maria, he said softly in Apache, what are your orders? Do we continue the fight? For a long moment, Maria didn't respond. She continued staring at the boulder, her massive hands clenching and unclenching as she struggled to process what had happened. Finally, she turned to face her war chief, and everyone present could see that something fundamental had changed in her expression. The contest is over, she said, her voice hollow and strangely fragile. I gave my word, and the word of Maria Strongheart has never been broken. We withdraw from this territory as agreed. Running Wolf's eyes widened in shock. But Maria, you are still the strongest among us. This changes nothing about your power or your leadership. It changes everything, Maria replied, her voice growing stronger as she made peace with the new reality. I claim to be stronger than any man alive. Today, a man proved me wrong. Not through trickery or luck, but through wisdom I did not possess. She turned to face Jake directly, her expression unreadable. You have won more than our contest, cowboy. You have shown me that strength alone is not enough. There are different kinds of power, and today yours proved superior to mine. Jake stepped forward, extending his hand once again. You're still the strongest person I've ever encountered. What you did with that boulder was incredible, wounded as you were. Don't let one defeat erase a lifetime of accomplishments. Maria looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before grasping it firmly. Her grip was still powerful despite her injuries and exhaustion, and Jake could feel the respect that now flowed between them. You are a worthy opponent. Jake Morrison, she said, using his name for the first time. I came here expecting to crush another weak cowboy and add to my legend. Instead, I learned that legends can be built on incomplete understanding. Red Williams and several other cowboys approached carefully, their weapons still ready but their aggressive postures relaxed. The immediate danger had passed, but they remained wary of the massive Apache woman who had proven so difficult to defeat. "What happens now?" Red asked his boss. "We just let them ride away after they attacked us?" Jake considered the question carefully. The Apache had indeed attacked without provocation, and by rights he would be justified in demanding some form of reparation or punishment. But looking at Maria's defeated expression, he realized that her humbling was perhaps punishment enough. "The lady gave her word that they would withdraw from this territory," Jake said finally. "I'm inclined to accept that as sufficient settlement for today's events." Maria nodded slowly, understanding the mercy she was being shown. "My word is my bond, cowboy. You will have no more trouble from my warriors in this land. We will find other places to hunt and raid. Maybe you should consider finding other things to do besides raiding," Jake suggested carefully. "Your strength and leadership could be put to better uses than attacking innocent families." The suggestion seemed to surprise Maria, as if the idea of using her abilities for something other than warfare had never occurred to her. She pondered his words while her warriors gathered their wounded and prepared to depart. "Perhaps," she said eventually, "this day has taught me that there are things I do not know, ways of thinking I have not considered. Maybe it is time for Maria Strongheart to learn new lessons." As the Apache began their withdrawal, Maria lingered for a moment beside the crater where the boulder had rested. She knelt and scooped up a handful of the earth, closing her massive fist around it as if trying to capture some essence of her defeat. "I will remember this place," she said to Jake. "And I will remember the man who taught me that strength comes in many forms. I'll remember it too," Jake replied. "And I'll remember the woman who showed me what true courage looks like. Even in defeat, you faced the truth with honor." Maria mounted her horse with some difficulty, her wounds making the simple action painful. But she sat straight in the saddle, her dignity intact despite her humiliation. As she prepared to lead her warriors away, she called out one final message. "Tell your people, Jake Morrison, that Maria Strongheart keeps her promises. This territory is under your protection now, and any Apache who troubles you will answer to me personally." With that, she wheeled her horse around and rode toward the canyon entrance, her warriors falling in behind her. The sound of hoofbeats gradually faded as the war party disappeared into the maze of rocks and shadows that marked the edge of Apache territory. Jake watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and regret. The immediate threat was over, and the wagon train could continue its journey to California in safety. But he also felt that he had witnessed something unique, a moment when two different worlds had collided and both had been changed by the experience. "Think we'll ever see her again?" Red Williams asked, moving up beside his boss. Jake considered the question as he looked toward the distant boulder that would forever mark the site of their unusual contest. "Maybe, but if we do, I suspect it won't be as enemies." As the wagon train prepared to resume its journey, stories of the incredible battle and its surprising conclusion were already beginning to spread among the settlers. The tale of Maria Strongheart and Jake Morrison would be told and retold around campfires throughout the territories, growing in the telling but never quite capturing the full complexity of what had actually occurred in that dusty canyon. For her part, Maria Strongheart rode into the desert with her worldview fundamentally altered. She was still the strongest woman alive, but she had learned that strength without wisdom was incomplete. The cowboy's victory had taught her that true power came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to choose the right approach to any challenge. It would be a lesson that would reshape not only her own life, but the lives of all those who followed her into whatever new adventures lay ahead in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American Southwest.